Imagine the sea. For an island nation like Great Britain, the sea is everything. It's a highway for food, a pipeline for fuel, a shield against invasion. In the autumn of 1939, as the world tipped into war, this lifeline felt secure. The Royal Navy was the most powerful in the world. The German fleet was small by comparison. The first few weeks of the war were strangely quiet, a period the papers called the phony war. But then something started to go wrong. Very wrong. Out in the coastal waters, in the shipping lanes that were the arteries of the nation, ships began to die. One moment, a freighter would be steaming steadily towards port. The next, a colossal pillar of water would erupt from beneath its hull, breaking its back and sending it to the bottom in minutes. There was no warning. Lookouts saw no torpedo tracks streaking through the water. Sailors scanned the skies and saw no enemy bombers. The ships were simply vanishing, swallowed by the sea. The first reports were confusing, treated as isolated accidents or the work of lone, lucky U-boats. But the pattern soon became terrifyingly clear. It wasn't just old cargo ships. It was tankers full of precious oil. It was ships carrying vital war materials. It was even the Royal Navy's own warships. An invisible enemy was stalking the British coast, an enemy that left no trace, an enemy that could strike anywhere, at any time. For the sailors on those ships, a new kind of fear began to set in. It wasn't the fear of a visible enemy you could fight back against. It was the fear of the water itself. The calm, gray sea they had known their whole lives had suddenly become a minefield, but one where the mines were ghosts. The Admiralty in London was baffled and deeply alarmed. Every loss was a stab to the heart of the war effort. Britain could only fight as long as its ships could sail. And now something was sinking them, and nobody knew what it was. What if you could turn the very laws of physics into a weapon? Deep within the German military's research departments, scientists had done just that. They had created a weapon that didn't need to see its target. It didn't need to hit it. It only needed to feel its presence. This new weapon was the Grundmine, the ground mine. Unlike the old-fashioned mines that floated on tethered cables and exploded on contact, these were different. They were cylinders packed with high explosives, designed to be dropped from the air or laid by submarines, and they would simply lie silently on the seabed, waiting. They were patient killers. The secret to their deadliness was a device called a magnetometer. In simple terms, it was an incredibly sensitive magnetic needle. We all know that the Earth itself is a giant magnet with its own magnetic field. This field is everywhere, a constant invisible force. But when a huge object made of steel, like a ship, moves through that field, it creates a disturbance, a tiny ripple in the force. The ship itself, built over months with hammers and rivets, becomes its own weak magnet. The German mine, sitting on the ocean floor, was designed to do one thing: feel that ripple. As the thousands of tons of steel in a ship's hull passed overhead, it would disturb the Earth's magnetic field just enough. The sensitive needle inside the mine would dip, closing an electrical circuit. And in that instant, the detonator would fire, and hundreds of kilograms of explosives would turn the water into a battering ram, striking the ship from below with devastating force. The beauty of this weapon, from the German perspective, was its stealth. It was a perfect trap. At night, Heinkel bombers would fly low over the English coast, not to drop bombs on cities, but to gently release these mines on parachutes into the mouths of rivers and the entrances to major ports, like the Thames estuary. They were sowing death on the seabed, creating invisible walls that would strangle Britain's trade and starve its people into submission. The losses started as a trickle, then became a flood. On November 21, 1939, the Royal Navy felt the sting of this new weapon directly and brutally. The brand-new destroyer, HMS Blanche, was patrolling off the Thames estuary when a violent explosion tore through her stern. The ship sank in minutes, taking many of her crew with her. There had been no U-boat, no warning. It was a profound shock to the Admiralty. If even a fast modern warship was vulnerable, what chance did a slow-moving merchant ship have? The answer was, very little. Throughout that grim winter, the list of lost ships grew longer each day. Over 50 ships, totaling more than 200,000 tons of vital shipping, were sent to the bottom. The port of London, the heart of the Empire's commerce, was effectively blockaded. Other ports faced the same silent threat. Ships that were desperately needed to carry food and weapons were either being sunk or were trapped in harbor, afraid to sail. The psychological effect was enormous. Sailors, brave men who would face a gun battle without flinching, were now terrified of what lay beneath them. It was a war against a ghost. Winston Churchill, who was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, immediately recognized the mortal danger. He later wrote in his memoirs that this magnetic mine was a deadly threat that could have, if left unchecked, doomed us to starvation and defeat. The entire British war strategy depended on control of the seas, and now, in their own home waters, they were losing control. The Germans had found Britain's Achilles heel. The nation's very survival hung in the balance, and the clock was ticking. Every ship that went down was another nail in the coffin of the British war effort. A solution had to be found, and it had to be found fast. But how do you fight an enemy you cannot see, an enemy that is nothing more than a law of physics turned against you? Sometimes, in the chaos of war, the outcome of a major campaign can hinge on a single moment of pure, dumb luck. For Great Britain, that moment came on a dark, wet night on November 23, 1939. A German Heinkel bomber was flying over the Thames estuary, its mission the same as many others before it, to sow more magnetic mines in the vital shipping channels. As the plane made its pass, the crew released one of the deadly cylinders. A parachute blossomed in the night sky, designed to slow the mine's descent and prevent it from being damaged on impact with the water. But this time, something went wrong for the Germans, and very right for the British. Perhaps it was a navigational error, a miscalculation of wind or tide. Instead of landing in the deep water of the channel, the mine drifted. It fell far short, landing not in the sea, but on a vast muddy sandbank near the coast of Shoeburyness. It settled gently into the soft, oozy mud. And then the tide went out. As the morning light broke, local coast watchers saw something strange out on the mudflats. It was a large metal object, clearly visible, lying half buried in the mud. They knew immediately it was something from the enemy. Crucially, it appeared to be completely intact. This was the gift the British had been praying for. For weeks, they had been fighting a phantom. All they knew was the effect of the weapon. They knew nothing of its cause. They had no idea how it worked, what it looked like, or how to defeat it. Now, by a 1 in a million chance, the enemy had dropped a perfect, undamaged specimen of its most secret weapon right on their doorstep. The mysterious killer was no longer a ghost. It was a physical object, lying in the mud, waiting to be examined. But getting to it and unlocking its secrets would require a level of bravery that bordered on suicidal. The message that reached the Royal Navy's mine and torpedo school, HMS Vernon, was electrifying. They finally had one. The task of dealing with it fell to a special team of bomb disposal experts, led by two incredibly brave men, Lieutenant Commander John Overy and Lieutenant Commander Roger Lewis. They were about to embark on one of the most dangerous missions of the entire war. They knew nothing about the device waiting for them in the mud. It could have a dozen different kinds of triggers. It could be designed to explode if it was moved, if it was tilted, if the light changed, or even if it detected the vibrations of their approach. Every step they took across the treacherous mudflats towards the mine was a step into the unknown. When they reached it, they saw a large aluminum cylinder with fittings and access panels. The real work had to begin immediately, before the tide came back in and submerged it again. The first and most critical rule was no steel. Since they suspected the mine was magnetic, any steel tool could potentially set it off. Every single instrument they used had to be made of non-magnetic materials like brass or bronze. Their wrenches, their screwdrivers, all specially made. Carefully, painstakingly, they began to work. They listened for the telltale ticking of a clockwork mechanism. Hearing none, they grew slightly more confident. With immense care, Ouvry began to unscrew the first detonator cap. His hands, covered in freezing mud, had to be perfectly steady. One slip, one scraped thread, could be the end. The tension was unbearable. The fate of Britain's war at sea rested on the steady hands and cool nerves of these men working against time on a desolate mudflat. After hours of painstaking work, they successfully removed the detonators and other key components, rendering the beast safe. They had looked death in the face and had not blinked. They had captured the devil's mechanism intact. Now the scientists could get to work. Once the disarmed mine was carefully transported back to the laboratories at HMS Vernon, the real intellectual detective work began. The casing was carefully cut open, revealing the weapon's inner secrets. To the scientists and engineers who gathered around it, it was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. But it was not magic. It was science. Inside, they found the charge of high explosives, the batteries to power it, and the detonators. But the heart of the device, its brain, was a beautifully crafted mechanism. It consisted of a horizontal metal rod, delicately balanced on a pivot, like a tiny seesaw. This rod was, in fact, a highly sensitive magnet. The scientists realized it was aligned with the Earth's magnetic field. They quickly understood the principle. The Earth's magnetic field isn't just a flat force, it has components. There's a horizontal component that makes a compass point north, and a vertical component that pulls one end of a compass needle down. The mine's trigger was designed to react specifically to a change in this vertical component. As a steel ship passed over it, the ship's own magnetic field would add to or subtract from the Earth's vertical field. This tiny change was enough to make one end of the balanced magnetic rod inside the mine dip down. As it dipped, it closed an electrical contact, and the circuit was complete. Boom! The secret was out. It was elegant, simple, and deadly. The mystery that had haunted the Royal Navy for months was solved. They weren't fighting a supernatural force, they were fighting an application of physics. And the wonderful thing about physics is that once you understand the rules, you can start to find ways to bend them to your own advantage. The knowledge of how the mine worked was the first and most important step towards defeating it. The question now was, what was the solution? With the enemy's secret laid bare, the British Admiralty didn't waste a second. A special committee was formed, bringing together some of the sharpest minds in the country. They needed a countermeasure, and they needed it yesterday. The group was officially called the Board of Admiralty Committee of 19, but its driving force was a man who would become one of the unsung heroes of the war. His name was Charles Goodeve. Goodeve was a Canadian chemist and physicist, a brilliant and energetic scientist who had been working for the Royal Navy. He wasn't a military man in the traditional sense. He was a problem solver. He had a rare gift for cutting through complex problems and finding practical, elegant solutions. When the challenge of the magnetic mine emerged, Goodeve was appointed to lead the scientific effort to find a way to defeat it. He and his team immediately locked onto the fundamental problem. The mine reacted to the magnetism of a ship. So the question was, how do you make a giant steel ship magnetically invisible? It seemed like an impossible task. A ship isn't something you can just switch off. Its magnetism was a fundamental part of its very being. The team began brainstorming every conceivable idea, no matter how wild. Could they build ships out of wood, not practical for warships? Could they send out small magnetic boats to trigger the mines ahead of the main convoys? too slow and dangerous. They needed a way to protect every single ship, from the biggest battleship to the smallest fishing trawler. Charles Goodeve knew that the answer would not be found in brute force, but in a deeper understanding of the physics involved. The race was on, not on the battlefield, but in the laboratory. The fate of the war at sea now rested on the shoulders of men in white coats, armed with chalkboards and slide rules. To solve the problem, Charles Goodeve and his team first had to explain it to the admirals and politicians in a way they could understand. Why, they asked, is a ship magnetic in the first place? The answer, he explained, lies in how it's built. A shipyard is a noisy, violent place. For months, a ship's steel plates are hammered, riveted, and welded together. All of this construction work takes place within the Earth's natural magnetic field. Steel is a ferromagnetic material, which means it can be easily magnetized. As workers hammered thousands of rivets into the hull, each impact was like a tiny nudge to the molecules inside the steel, aligning them with the Earth's magnetic field. The constant vibration and heat from welding also helped this process along. Over time, the entire ship's hull, from bow to stern, became one enormous permanent magnet. It had its own north and south pole, just like a toy magnet, but on a massive scale. This permanent magnetism was locked into the very structure of the ship. So, when the ship sailed, it carried this huge magnetic field with it, projecting an invisible magnetic signature into the water around it. It was this signature that the German mines were designed to detect. Goodeve used simple diagrams to show the admirals the lines of magnetic force flowing out from a ship's hull and disturbing the Earth's natural field. He made them understand that their ships were, in effect, broadcasting their presence to the enemy, waiting silently on the seabed. This clear and simple explanation was a breakthrough. It moved the problem out of the realm of mysterious enemy magic and into the world of measurable science. Once you understand that your ship is a magnet, the next logical question becomes, is there a way to turn the magnet off? The first idea the scientists came up with was logical, but ultimately clumsy and inefficient. If a ship's hull was a magnet, maybe they could wipe the magnetism away, like erasing a chalk mark on a blackboard. This process was called, appropriately, wiping. The method was brute force. A huge, thick electrical cable, hundreds of feet long, was brought to a ship docked in harbor. This cable was then physically dragged and lifted around the ship's hull over and over again. A powerful electrical current was passed through the cable, creating an intense magnetic field. The idea was to use this strong external field to scramble the organized magnetic alignment within the ship's steel, effectively neutralizing its permanent magnetism. For a short time, it worked. A ship that had been wiped had a much smaller magnetic signature. But there were major problems. The process was incredibly slow and labor-intensive. It required a ship to be taken out of service and brought into a specially equipped port. It took hours to treat just one vessel. Worse, the effect wasn't permanent. As the ship sailed, the constant vibration of its engines and the pounding of the waves would, over a few weeks, cause the steel to gradually become magnetized again by the Earth's field. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. You could make a little progress, but the tide would always come back in. Wiping was a temporary fix, a stopgap measure. It might save a few ships, but it was not a sustainable solution to protect the thousands of vessels that Britain depended on. A better, more permanent, and more brilliant idea was needed, and it was Charles Goodeve who would provide it. Charles Goodeve looked at the problem of wiping and realized they were thinking about it all wrong. Why try to erase the ship's magnetic field when that was a constant uphill battle? Why not instead just cancel it out? This was the moment of genius, the conceptual leap that would change everything. Goodeve's idea was both simple and revolutionary. He knew from basic physics that an electrical current running through a coil of wire creates a magnetic field. What if, he proposed, we put a coil of wire around the ship itself? What if we passed a carefully controlled electrical current through that coil? This current would create a second magnetic field. And if you controlled the direction and strength of that current correctly, you could create a field that was the exact opposite of the ship's own magnetic field. The two fields, the ship's natural magnetism pointing down and the coil's artificial magnetism pointing up, would meet and cancel each other out. The net result would be a ship with a magnetic signature of almost zero. To the sensitive German mind waiting on the seabed, the ship would become a magnetic ghost. It would pass overhead, but the mine would feel nothing. The ship would be, for all intents and purposes, invisible. The name given to this process was degaussing, named after Carl Friedrich Gauss, a 19th-century mathematician who had done pioneering work in the field of magnetism. It was a perfect name for a perfect solution. It wasn't a temporary fix like wiping. The degaussing coil would be permanently installed on the ship. The crew could turn it on whenever they entered dangerous waters. It was a permanent active defense system. It was, quite simply, brilliant. An idea, no matter how brilliant, is just a theory until it is tested in the real world. The Admiralty wasted no time. Goodeve's degaussing concept was fast-tracked for an immediate, high-stakes trial. The ship chosen for this crucial experiment was a humble minesweeper, HMS Broome. In a naval dockyard, workers scrambled to install the first-ever degaussing system. They ran a thick, insulated copper cable all the way around the outside of the ship's hull, like a giant belt. This cable was connected to the ship's electrical generators. The moment of truth arrived. The test location was a quiet stretch of water where the Royal Navy had placed one of the captured German magnetic mines. The mine was live. Its trigger mechanism, the same type that had sent dozens of ships to the bottom, was active and waiting. The scientists and naval officers watched from a safe distance, their hearts in their throats. Everything depended on this test. HMS Broome, with its strange new belt of cables, powered up its system. A carefully calculated current began to flow through the coil, creating the invisible magnetic cloak that Goodeve had envisioned. Slowly, deliberately, the little ship steamed forward, heading directly over the spot where the mine lay waiting. The observers held their breath. The ship passed over the mine. Nothing happened, no explosion, no pillar of water, just the quiet sound of the ship's engines. They couldn't believe it. They ordered the ship to turn around and pass over it again, and again, and again. Each time, the result was the same: silence. The mine remained dormant, completely fooled. The theory had worked perfectly. It was a moment of pure triumph. In that quiet channel, a small group of scientists had just won one of the most important battles of the Second World War. The invisible enemy now had an invisible shield. With the stunning success of the HMS Broome trial, the next challenge was to figure out how to apply this new technology to the thousands of ships in the British fleet. It quickly became clear that a one-size-fits-all solution wouldn't work. Ships came in all shapes and sizes, and their magnetic signatures were all different. Two main methods of degaussing were developed to tackle this problem. The first and most common was called coiling. This was the method used on HMS Broome. It involved installing a large electrical cable, or coil, around the ship. On many merchant ships and smaller warships, this coil was simply laid on the main deck, a thick black cable running along the ship's outer edges. It was a relatively quick and easy installation. For other ships, particularly new ones under construction, the coils could be built directly into the ship's structure, hidden from view. This coiling method was perfect for creating a field to counteract the ship's vertical magnetism, the main trigger for the German mines. But for larger, more important warships like cruisers and battleships, a more sophisticated technique was needed. This was called deperming. A ship's magnetism had two components, a permanent one that was hammered in during construction and a temporary one induced by its position in the Earth's magnetic field. Deperming was a more intense process designed to drastically reduce the ship's permanent magnetism. It involved wrapping the entire ship in massive cables at the dockyard and zapping it with powerful, carefully controlled pulses of electricity. This effectively reset the magnetic alignment of the hull's steel. While deperming was more effective, it was also much slower and required special facilities. In the race against time, coiling was the workhorse. It was the faster, simpler solution that could be applied to the vast majority of ships, providing them with the protection they so desperately needed. The success of degaussing triggered one of the most impressive industrial and logistical efforts of the war. It was no longer a question of science, but of sheer scale. The order went out from the Admiralty. Every single ship, military and civilian, that sailed in British waters needed to be fitted with degaussing coils as soon as possible. It was a monumental undertaking. Britain's shipyards, already working around the clock to build new ships and repair damaged ones, were given this massive new task. Teams of electricians and engineers swarmed over every vessel that came into port. They worked on battleships and fishing boats, on oil tankers and passenger liners. The demand for materials was immense. The country was suddenly faced with a desperate shortage of insulated copper cable. Factories across the nation were retooled to produce nothing but this vital wire. It was said that Britain used so much copper for degaussing coils that there was none left for anything else. Hundreds, then thousands of miles of cable were produced and rushed to the ports. Special degaussing stations were set up in every major harbor. It was an assembly line of survival. A ship would come in with its cargo, and before it could be loaded again, the degaussing crew would be on board, laying the cables, connecting the power source, and testing the system. By the middle of 1940, an incredible achievement had been reached. Over 1,000 ships were being fitted with degaussing systems every single month. It was a quiet, unglamorous battle, fought not with guns, but with wiring diagrams and soldering irons. But this industrial miracle, carried out by ordinary workers in freezing dockyards, was just as crucial to winning the war as any battle fought on land or at sea. They were weaving a shield of copper wire around the entire nation. The impact of the mass degaussing program was not just significant, it was immediate and spectacular. The results could be seen clearly in the cold, hard numbers of naval losses. Statistics, which had been telling a story of impending disaster, now told a story of miraculous recovery. Let's look at the numbers. In December of 1939, at the height of the magnetic mine crisis, Britain lost 27 ships to this one weapon alone. The shipping lanes were a death trap. The Admiralty projected that if these losses continued, the entire war effort would collapse within a year. But then, the degaussing coils began to appear on ships. In January 1940, the number of ships sunk by magnetic mines dropped. In February, it dropped again. By June of 1940, a time when Britain was fighting for its life after the fall of France, the threat from the magnetic mine had been almost completely eliminated. The losses had fallen to virtually zero. A weapon that had held the power to strangle the nation had been rendered obsolete in less than 6 months. It was one of the most decisive and rapid victories of the entire war, achieved not by admirals, but by scientists. For the German High Command, it was a source of complete bewilderment. Their wonder weapon had suddenly stopped working. Their intelligence reports started to mention strange cables being fitted to British ships, but they didn't immediately grasp the physics behind it. They had laid their perfect trap, and the British had simply found a way to walk right over it without setting it off. The graphs in Churchill's war room showed the dramatic plunge in losses. Every downward tick on that graph represented a ship that made it to port, a cargo of food that fed a city, a tank that armed an army, and a crew of sailors that made it home alive. Protecting your own ships was one thing, but what about actively clearing the minefields that the Germans had already laid? Alongside the defensive shield of degaussing, the British developed an offensive weapon to hunt and destroy the mines. This clever invention was called the double L sweep. The name sounds strange, but the principle was a direct application of the same science used for degaussing. The system worked like this. 2 minesweepers would sail in parallel, a good distance apart from each other. Trailing behind them were 2 long floating cables. One cable had a positive electrode at the end, and the other had a negative one. When a powerful electrical current was passed from one ship, down one cable, through the water to the other electrode, and back up the second cable to the other ship, it created a massive magnetic field in the sea between the 2 vessels. In effect, the 2 ships were creating a huge artificial magnetic signature, far larger than any real ship, in the water well behind them. They would sail together through a suspected minefield. As this powerful magnetic pulse passed over the German mines lying on the seabed, the mines were tricked. They thought a massive battleship was passing overhead and would detonate. Huge plumes of water would erupt far behind the minesweepers, a safe distance away. The double L sweep allowed the Royal Navy to go on the offensive. They could now systematically clean the critical shipping channels, detonating the mines and making the waterways safe again. It was the perfect complement to degaussing. Degaussing made individual ships invisible, while the double L sweep made the minefields themselves disappear. Together, these 2 innovations broke the back of Germany's first great secret weapon campaign of the war. For the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, the sudden failure of their magnetic mine campaign was a source of deep frustration and confusion. They had possessed a weapon that was winning the war for them, a weapon that was bleeding Britain dry with almost no risk to their own forces. And then it just stopped working. German pilots flying over the English coast reported seeing fewer and fewer explosions. U-boat captains who laid mines in harbor entrances saw ships sailing in and out, seemingly without a care. At first, they thought the mines themselves were faulty, perhaps a problem with the manufacturing process. But tests showed the mines were still perfect. The problem wasn't with their weapon, it was with the targets. German intelligence services began to pick up clues. Aerial reconnaissance photos and reports from spies started to show a strange new feature on British ships: a thick cable running around the edge of the deck. They didn't understand its purpose. Was it some kind of protective bumper? Was it for communication? The idea that it was generating an invisible magnetic shield sounded like science fiction. It took them precious months to figure out the truth. By the time they did, the damage was done. Their strategic advantage was lost. This failure forced German weapons designers back to the drawing board. They realized that the war at sea was becoming a technological arms race. If the British could defeat a magnetic trigger, then Germany would have to invent a new kind of trigger. This led directly to the next phase of the mine war, the development of acoustic mines designed to be detonated by the sound of a ship's propellers, and later, pressure mines, triggered by the change in water pressure as a ship passed overhead. But the British had bought themselves time, a critical breathing space, thanks to the genius of Charles Goodeve and the industrial might of their shipyards. The victory over the magnetic mine was more than just a strategic or industrial triumph. It was a profound psychological victory. To understand its importance, you have to put yourself in the shoes of a merchant sailor in late 1939. Every time your ship left port, you were sailing into a lottery of death. The enemy wasn't a warship you could see or a plane you could shoot at. The enemy was the water itself. A calm sea, which should have been a welcome sight, became the most terrifying because it was in those calm, shallow coastal waters that the mines were most effective. The constant gnawing tension took a heavy toll on the morale of the crews. They called the afflicted areas demon seas. But then the degaussing coils started to appear. At first, sailors were skeptical of this strange electric wire, as they called it. It seemed like a bizarre scientific gadget, a flimsy defense against such a deadly threat. But then they started to hear the stories. Ships with the coils were making it through. Ships without them were not. Confidence began to grow. The degaussing system was something tangible, something proactive. The crew could switch it on. They were no longer helpless victims. They were actively defending themselves. This sense of empowerment was a massive boost to morale. The fear of the unknown was replaced by a faith in technology. It sent a powerful message to the entire nation. We are not just tough, we are also smart. We can outthink the enemy. This belief in the power of science and ingenuity to overcome threats would become a hallmark of the British war effort, strengthening the resolve of everyone from the sailors on the convoys to the families waiting for them at home. The psychological grip of the magnetic mine had been broken. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest and arguably the most important campaign of the Second World War. If Britain lost control of its Atlantic lifeline, it would be starved into surrender. The entire war depended on the flow of ships bringing food, oil, troops, and weapons from North America. In this epic struggle, the defeat of the magnetic mine in 1940 was a foundational victory. Had the degaussing solution not been found so quickly, the consequences would have been catastrophic. The German U-boats were already a serious threat in the open ocean. If the magnetic mines had continued to effectively blockade Britain's ports, the convoy system would have collapsed. Ships that survived the perilous Atlantic crossing would have been sunk at their final destination, just miles from shore. The port of Liverpool, the main artery for Atlantic convoys, would have been choked off. The port of London would have been unusable. The entire logistical network that supplied the nation would have ground to a halt. In short, neutralizing the magnetic mine threat was a precondition for Britain's survival. It allowed the Battle of the Atlantic to be fought where the Royal Navy had a better chance, in the deep waters against the U-boats. It cleared the home front, ensuring that the convoys had safe harbors to reach. Without degaussing, the story of 1940 might have been very different. The Battle of Britain in the skies might never have been won because the Spitfires and Hurricanes would have run out of fuel. The British Army would have been deprived of weapons and reinforcements. The victory won in the laboratories of HMS Vernon was, therefore, just as important as any victory won at sea. It kept Britain in the war during its darkest hour. The spirit of alliance during the Second World War meant that critical technological breakthroughs were not kept secret from one's friends. Having developed a life-saving technology, the British immediately shared the secrets of degaussing with their allies, most importantly, the United States. Even before the attack on Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, British scientific missions were traveling to the U.S., sharing everything they had learned. They provided the Americans with the designs, the scientific principles, and the practical lessons learned from installing thousands of systems. This act of sharing had enormous benefits. When the United States did enter the war in December 1941, its Navy was already prepared for the threat of magnetic mines. American shipyards didn't have to go through the same painful learning process that Britain had endured. They could immediately start building degaussing systems, known as deperming coils in the U.S. Navy, into their new warships. From the giant aircraft carriers that would fight in the Pacific to the thousands of Liberty ships that would form the backbone of the Atlantic convoys, nearly all were equipped with this British-invented technology. This saved countless American ships and thousands of sailors' lives, both in the Atlantic fighting German mines and in the Pacific, where the Japanese also used magnetic naval mines extensively. The story of degaussing is a perfect example of successful Allied cooperation. It shows how the sharing of knowledge and technology could be as powerful a weapon as any tank or battleship. A solution born from a crisis in the Thames estuary ended up protecting ships all over the world. a testament to the idea that in a global conflict, a shared victory is the only kind that matters. War is a relentless cycle of problem and solution, of measure and countermeasure. The moment the British solved the problem of the magnetic mine, the Germans were already working on the next problem for them to solve. The technological arms race in the secret war of naval mines was far from over. Having seen their magnetic detonators rendered useless by degaussing, German engineers pivoted to new types of triggers that didn't rely on magnetism at all. The first of these was the acoustic mine. This was a device designed to listen. It was fitted with a hydrophone and underwater microphone that was tuned to the specific frequency of a ship's propellers. It would lie dormant on the seabed until the signature thrum, thrum, thrum of an approaching ship reached a certain volume. Then it would explode. This created a whole new set of challenges for the Allies. They had to develop countermeasures, such as special noisemakers towed behind ships to trigger the mines at a safe distance. Later in the war, the Germans introduced an even more cunning device, the pressure mine. This mine was equipped with a sensitive diaphragm that could detect the tiny change in water pressure created when a massive ship passes over it. As a ship moves, it displaces water, creating a zone of slightly increased pressure under its bow and stern, and a zone of decreased pressure amidships. The pressure mine was designed to detonate in response to this specific pressure signature. This was an incredibly difficult weapon to counter, as there was no easy way to create a false pressure signature to sweep for them. The battle of wits continued throughout the war, a constant struggle between the weapon designers and the scientists charged with defeating them. The victory over the magnetic mine was just the first round in a long and deadly game. In the grand narrative of World War II, history tends to remember the generals, the prime ministers, and the famous battlefield commanders. But the war was also won by people whose names are largely forgotten, quiet individuals whose contributions were just as vital. Charles Goodeve is one of those individuals. After his revolutionary work on degaussing, he didn't rest. He continued to lead the Department of Miscellaneous Weapon Development, a quirky name for a group that was at the forefront of British scientific innovation, working on everything from anti-submarine weapons to battlefield engineering solutions. After the war, Goodeve didn't seek fame or public office. He returned to what he loved, science and industry. He was knighted for his services, becoming Sir Charles Goodeve, and went on to lead the British Iron and Steel Research Association. He dedicated the rest of his career to using science to improve industrial processes, making them more efficient and productive. His story is a powerful reminder that history is often shaped by people far from the front lines. Without his insight, his energy, and his ability to translate a complex physics problem into a practical engineering solution, the course of the war could have been very different. He wasn't a soldier, but his intellect was a weapon that saved thousands of ships and tens of thousands of lives. He represents a whole class of boffins, the wartime scientists and engineers whose ingenuity proved to be one of Britain's most potent assets. While his name may not be as famous as Montgomery or Churchill, the legacy of his work is still sailing on every naval vessel that puts to sea today. The invention of degaussing created a need for a whole new type of naval facility, the degaussing station or range. It wasn't enough to simply install the coils on a ship. The system had to be precisely calibrated. Each ship's magnetic signature was unique, and it could change over time as the ship traveled or took on different cargo. To keep the degaussing systems working perfectly, they needed to be regularly checked and adjusted. To do this, special ranges were set up in major ports and naval bases around the world. A typical degaussing range consisted of a series of sensitive magnetic sensors, or magnetometers, laid out on the seabed in a precise pattern. These sensors were connected by underwater cables to a control station on shore. When a ship needed its system calibrated, it would sail slowly and carefully over this grid of sensors. As it passed, the sensors on the seabed would measure every tiny fluctuation in the magnetic field, building up a detailed profile of the ship's magnetic signature. The data was relayed to the specialists in the control hut. They could see exactly how magnetic the ship was and in what areas. Based on these readings, they would then radio instructions back to the ship's crew. Increase the current in your main coil by 5%, or adjust the aft coil to this setting. The ship would make the adjustments and then pass over the range again until its magnetic signature was as close to neutral as possible. These humble stations, often just a few small buildings on a pier, were a critical part of the infrastructure of this new technology, ensuring that the invisible shield protecting every Allied ship was always operating at peak effectiveness. It's a fascinating sign of a technology's impact when its name breaks out of the laboratory and enters the common language. The word degaussing did exactly that. Born in the desperate circumstances of 1939 as a highly specific naval term, it proved to be such a useful concept that it was adopted in many other fields. The core idea, using an opposing magnetic field to remove unwanted magnetism, had widespread applications. For decades, the most common place a civilian would encounter the word degauss was on their television set or computer monitor. Old CRT screens, the big, bulky ones, worked by firing beams of electrons at the screen, guided by magnetic fields. Over time, these screens could pick up stray magnetism, which would distort the colors and ruin the picture. To fix this, monitors had a built-in degaussing coil. When you pressed the degauss button, you would hear a strange thwump sound and see the image wobble for a second. That was the sound of the coil firing, creating a magnetic field to scramble the unwanted magnetism and restore the picture to its pure colors. The term was also essential in the world of information technology. Magnetic storage, like on cassette tapes, floppy disks, or old computer hard drives, worked by arranging tiny magnetic particles. To securely erase the data on these devices, you couldn't just delete the files. You had to degauss them with a powerful magnetic field, completely randomizing the particles and wiping the information permanently. From protecting nations to fixing TVs, the legacy of Charles Goodeve's invention lived on in the vocabulary of the modern world, a quiet reminder of a secret war won with the power of physics. The threat may have changed, but the solution endures. The technology of degaussing, forged in the heat of the Second World War, is not a historical relic. It is a living, evolving, and essential part of modern naval warfare. Today, every major military vessel, from the most advanced stealth destroyer to the quietest nuclear submarine, is equipped with a highly sophisticated degaussing system. The basic principle remains the same as the one tested on HMS Broome in 1939, but the technology has advanced light years. Modern systems are no longer just a simple belt of cable. They are complex grids of coils built deep inside the ship's hull, controlled by computers. These computers are constantly monitored by sensors that measure the ship's magnetic signature in real time. The system can automatically adjust the current in different coils as the ship turns or moves through different parts of the world, maintaining a near-perfectly neutral magnetic signature at all times. Why is this still so important? Because naval mines have also evolved. Modern sea mines are smarter and deadlier than ever. They can be programmed to target the specific magnetic, acoustic, and pressure signatures of enemy warships. For a modern navy, managing a ship's signature is a key part of stealth and survival. Reducing the magnetic signature makes a ship much harder for these smart mines to detect and classify. It is a fundamental element of electronic camouflage. The legacy of that frantic race for a solution in 1939 is that today sailors are still protected by the same fundamental idea: an invisible shield of energy that makes a mountain of steel look like nothing more than a ghost to the dangers lurking below. In the final analysis, the story of degaussing is more than just a tale of technology. It is a powerful example of a different kind of war, a war won not in a muddy trench or a churning sea, but in a quiet laboratory. It demonstrates that sometimes the most decisive weapon is not a bigger gun or a faster ship, but a brilliant idea. The magnetic mine was a threat that could not be defeated by conventional military force. The Royal Navy could have had 1,000 ships, but they would have been useless against an enemy they couldn't see or fight. The victory was achieved by shifting the battlefield from the ocean to the chalkboard. It was won by the courage of men like John Ouvry, who risked everything to dismantle a live mine with their bare hands. It was won by the intellect of men like Charles Goodeve, who saw a problem in physics and devised an elegant solution. And it was won by the tireless effort of thousands of anonymous workers in shipyards who turned that solution into a reality on an industrial scale. This story proves that the course of history can be turned by a single, critical insight. It is a testament to the power of human ingenuity in the face of a mortal threat. The invisible death that lurked on the seabed was ultimately defeated by an invisible shield of scientific principle. It was a victory of mind over matter, a war won with the quiet, world-changing power of a bright idea.